Good morning, family and friends and children. This is a continuation today of the story of the 100-year-old man who climbed out of the window and disappeared. This is chapter 3, and we're going from page 1 to page 37 if we don't get any interruptions. I'm not sure what I'll do if that happens. I've turned off the mobile. Can't do that with the landline. So we'll begin. Monday, 2nd of May 2005 is when this part of the story continues from in the life of Alan. Here we go. Just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 2nd of May 2005, the calm of Malcoping was shattered. At first, Director Alice at the Old People's Home was worried rather than angry, and pulled out her master key. Since Alan had not concealed his escape route, it was obvious that the birthday boy had climbed out of the window. Judging by the tracks, he'd then stood among the pansies in the flower bed before disappearing. By virtue of his position, the mayor felt he should take command. He ordered the staff to search in pairs. Alan couldn't be far away. The searchers should concentrate on the immediate vicinity. One pair was dispatched to the park, one to the state-run liquor store, a place that Alan had occasionally frequented. Director Alice knew that. One to the other on the shops on Main Street, and one to the community centre up on the hill. The mayor himself would stay at the Old People's Home to keep an eye on the residents who hadn't vanished into thin air, and to ponder the next move. He told the searchers that they should be discreet. There was no need to generate unnecessary publicity about this affair. In the general confusion, the mayor forgot that one of the pairs of searchers he had just sent out consisted of a reporter from the local paper and her photographer. But the bus station was not included in the mayor's primary search area. In that location, however, a very angry, slightly built young man with long greasy blonde hair, a scraggly beard, and a denim jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back had already searched every corner of the building. Since there was no trace of either a very old man or a suitcase, the young man took some decisive steps towards the little man behind the only open ticket window to find out where either or both have gone. Although the little man was generally bored with his work, he still had his professional pride, so he explained to the loud-mouthed young man that the passenger's privacy was not something that could be compromised, adding firmly that under no circumstances whatsoever would he give him any information of the type that he wished to obtain. The young man stood in silence for a moment. He then moved 5 yards to the left to the not very solid door to the ticket office. He didn't bother to check whether it was locked. Instead, he took a step back and kicked the door in with his boot, sending splinters flying in every direction. The little man did not even have time to lift the telephone receiver to phone for help before he was dangling in the air in front of the young man, who had grasped him firmly by the ears. "I might not know anything about privacy, but I'm good at getting people to talk," said the young man to the little ticket seller before he let him drop down with a bump onto his revolving office chair, at which point the young man explained what he intended to do with the little man's genitals with the help of a hammer and nails if the little man did not comply with his wishes. The description was so realistic that the little man immediately decided to say what he thought, namely that the old man in question had presumably taken a bus in the direction of Strangnass. Whether the man had taken a suitcase with him he couldn't say, as he was not the sort of person who spied on his customers. The ticket seller then stopped talking to ascertain how satisfied the young man was with what he'd said, and immediately determined that it would be best for him to provide further information. So he said that on the journey between Malcoping and Strangnass there were 12 more stops, and that the old man could of course get out at any one of those. The person who would know was the bus driver, and according to the timetable he would be back in Malcoping at 7:10 that same evening, when the bus made its return journey to Flen. The young man sat down beside the terrified little man with the throbbing ears. "Just need to think," he said. So he thought. He thought that he should certainly be able to shake the bus driver's mobile phone number out of the little man, and then call the driver and say that the old man's suitcase was actually stolen property. But then, of course, stolen property would involve the police, and that was not something the young man wanted. Besides, it was probably not so urgent really, because the old man seemed dreadfully old, and now that he had a suitcase to drag around, he would need to travel by train, bus or taxi if he wanted to continue his journey from the station to Strangnass. He would thus leave new tracks behind him, and there would always be somebody who could be dangled by the ears to say where the old man was heading. The young man had confidence in his ability to persuade people to tell him what they knew. When the youth had finished thinking, he decided to wait for the bus to return so he could interview the driver without undue politeness. When he had decided, the young man got up again and explained to the ticket seller what would happen to him, his wife, his children, and his home if he told the police or anybody else what had just occurred. The little man had neither wife nor children, but he was eager to keep his ears and genitals more or less intact, so he gave his word as an employee of the National Railways that no one would get a peep out of him. That was a promise he kept until the next day. The two-man search groups came back to the old people's home and reported on what they had seen, or rather hadn't seen. The mayor instinctively did not want to involve the police, and he was desperately trying to think of alternatives when the local newspaper reporter dared to ask, "And what are you going to do now, Mr. Mayor?" The mayor was silent for a few moments. Then he said, "Call the police, of course." God, how he hated the free press. Alan woke when the driver kindly nudged him and announced that they had now reached Byringe Station. Shortly afterwards, the driver manoeuvred the suitcase out of the front door of the bus, with Alan close behind, The driver asked if he could now manage on his own, and Alan said that the driver had no need to worry in that respect. Then Alan thanked him for his help and waved goodbye as the bus rolled out onto the main road again. Tall fir trees blocked the afternoon sun, and Alan was starting to feel a bit chilly in his thin jacket and indoor slippers. He could see no sign of Byringe, let alone its station. There was just forest, forest, forest and forest in all directions, and a little gravel road leading to the right. Alan thought that perhaps there were warm clothes in the suitcase he had on impulse brought along with him. Unfortunately, the suitcase was locked, and without a screwdriver or some other tool, it was surely hopeless to try to open it. There was no other option but to start moving, otherwise he would freeze to death. The suitcase had a strap at the top, and if you pulled it, the suitcase rolled along nicely on its small wheels. Alan followed just behind. He followed the gravel road into the forest with short, shuffling steps. The suitcase followed just behind him, skidding on the gravel. After a few hundred yards, Alan came to what must be Byringe Station, a closed-down building next to a most definitely and absolutely closed-down former railway line. Alan was a prize specimen as far as centenarians went, but it was all getting to be a bit too much. He sat down on the suitcase to gather his thoughts and strength. To Alan's left stood the shabby yellow two-storey station. All the windows on the bottom floor were covered with planks. To his right you could follow the closed-down railway line into the distance, straight as an arrow, even deeper into the forest. Nature had not yet succeeded in entirely eating up the tracks, but it was only a matter of time. The wooden platform was evidently no longer safe to walk on. On the outermost planking you could still read a painted sign: "Do not walk on the track." The track was certainly not dangerous to walk on, thought Alan, but who in his right mind would voluntarily walk on the platform? That question was answered immediately, because at that very moment the shabby door of the station building was opened, and a man in his 70s, wearing a cap and solid boots, stepped out of the house. He clearly trusted the planks not to give way, and he was entirely focused on the old man in front of him. His initial attitude was hostile, but then he seemed to change his mind, possibly as a result of seeing the decrepitude of this trespasser. Alan sat on the newly stolen suitcase, not knowing what to say, and in any case lacking the energy to say it. But he looked steadily at the man, letting him make the first move. "Who are you? And what are you doing in my station?" asked the man with the cap. Alan didn't answer. He couldn't decide whether he was dealing with friend or foe. But then he decided that it would be wise not to argue with the only person around, someone who might even let Alan inside before the evening chill set in. He decided to tell it like it was. Alan told the man that his name was Alan, and that he was exactly 100 years old and spry for his age, So spry, in fact, that he was on the run from the old people's home. He'd also had time to steal a suitcase from a young man who by now would certainly not be particularly happy about it. His knees were not for the moment at their best, and he would very much like to give them a rest. Alan then fell silent, awaiting the court's verdict. "Is that so?" said the man in the cap, and smiled. "A thief!" He jumped nimbly down from the platform and went over to the centenarian to have a closer look. "Are you really 100 years old?" he asked. "In that case you must be hungry." Alan couldn't follow the logic, but of course he was hungry. So he asked what was on the menu, and if a nip of the hard stuff might be included. The man with the cap stretched out his hand, introduced himself as Julius Johnson, and pulled the old man to his feet. He then announced that he would personally carry Alan's suitcase and that roast elk was on the bill, if that suited, and that there would absolutely be a nip of the hard stuff to go with it, or rather, enough to take care of the knees, and the rest of him too. Julius Johnson had not had anybody to talk to for several years, so he was pleased to meet the old man with the suitcase. A drop of the hard stuff first for one knee and then for the other, followed by a drop more for the back and neck, and then some to whet the appetite, all in all made for a convivial atmosphere. Alan asked what Julius did for a living and got his whole story. Julius was born in the north of Sweden, the only child of Anders and Elvina Johnson. Julius worked as a labourer on the family farm and was beaten every day by his father, who was of the opinion that Julius was good for nothing. When Julius was 25, his mother died of cancer, which Julius grieved over, and shortly afterwards his father was swallowed by the bog when he tried to rescue a heifer. Julius grieved over that too, because he was fond of the heifer. For those who don't know what a heifer is, it's a cow. Young Julius had no talent for the farming life. In this, his father had essentially been right, nor did he have any desire for it. So he sold everything except a few acres of forest that he thought might come in handy in his old age. He went off to Stockholm, and within 2 years had squandered all his money. Oh, how sad. He then returned to the forest. With great enthusiasm, Julius put in a bid to supply 5,000 electricity poles to Hoodie's Ixval Electrical Company, and since Julius didn't concern himself with such details as employment, tax and VAT, he won the bid, and with the help of a dozen Hungarian refugees, he managed to deliver the poles on time, and was paid more money than he knew existed. So far, all was well. The problem was that Julius had been obliged to cheat a little. The trees were not fully grown, so the poles were a yard shorter than what had been ordered. This would probably have gone unnoticed if it hadn't been for the fact that virtually every farmer in the area had just acquired a combine harvester. The Hudiksvall District Electrical Company stuck up the poles with cable crisscrossing fields and meadows in the area, and when it was harvest time, on one single morning, the cables were pulled down in 26 locations by 22 different newly bought combine harvesters. The entire region had no electricity for weeks as harvests were lost, milking machines stopped working. It was not long before the farmers' fury, at first directed against the Huddersfield District Electrical Company, was turned against young Julius. The town slogan, "Happy Huddersfield," was not on many people's lips at the time, I can tell you. Julius said, "I had to hide at the town hotel in Sundersfield for 7 months, and then I ran out of money. Shall we have another swig of the hard stuff?" Julius continued his story. After being nearly run down by a tractor in the centre of Sundersfield, driven by a farmer with a murderous look in his eyes, he realised the locals weren't going to forget his little mistake for the next 100 years. So he moved a long way south and ended up in Maryfred, where he did a bit of small-time thieving for a while until he tired of town life and managed to acquire the former station building in Byringe for 25,000 crowns. He happened to find one night in a safe at the Gripsholm Inn. Here at the station he now lived, essentially via handouts from the state, poaching in his neighbour's forest, small-scale production and sale of alcoholic spirits from his home distilling apparatus, and resale of what goods he could get hold of from his neighbours. He wasn't particularly popular in the neighbourhood, Julius went on, and between mouthfuls Alan answered that he could imagine as much. When Julius suggested having one final snifter for dessert, Alan answered that he'd always had a weakness for desserts of that kind, but that first of all he must seek out a toilet, if there possibly happened to be one in the building. Julius got up, turned on the ceiling lamp since it was starting to get dark, and then pointed to the stairs, saying that there was a functional lavatory on the right. He promised to have 2 newly poured drams ready and waiting when Alan returned. Alan found the toilet where Julius had said it would be. He stood in position to pee, and as usual the last drops didn't quite make it to the bowl. Some of them landed softly on his pea slippers instead. Halfway through this process, Alan heard a noise on the stairs. His first thought was that it was Julius going off with his newly stolen suitcase. The noise got louder. Somebody was climbing the stairs. Alan realised that there was a chance that the steps he heard outside the door belonged to a slightly built young man with long, greasy, blonde hair, scraggly beard and a denim jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back. And that if it was him, then it probably wasn't going to be a pleasant encounter. The bus returning from Strangnass arrived at Malcoping station 3 minutes early. The bus carried no passengers, and the driver had accelerated a little bit extra after the last bus stop to have time to catch his breath before continuing the journey to Flen. But the driver had barely lit his cigarette before a slightly built youth with long, greasy blonde hair, scraggly beard and a denim jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back arrived. "Are you going to Flen?" The driver asked a little hesitantly because there was something about the young man that didn't feel right. "I'm not going to Flen, and neither are you," answered the young man. Hanging around waiting for 4 hours for the bus to come back had been a bit too much for what little patience the youth could muster. Besides, after half that time he'd realised that if instead he had immediately stolen a car, he could have caught up with the bus long before Strangnas. On top of it all, police cars had started to cruise around in the little town. At any time the police could stumble into the station and start interrogating the little man behind the window in the ticket office as to why he looked terrified and why the door to his office was hanging at an angle on one hinge. The young man had no idea what the cops were doing there. His boss, who never again had chosen Malcoping as the transaction venue for 3 reasons. First, it was close to Stockholm. Second, it had relatively good transport options. And third, and most important, because the long arm of the law wasn't long enough to reach there. There were simply no cops in Malcoping. Or to be more precise, there shouldn't be, and yet the place was crawling with them. The young man had seen 2 cars and a total of 4 policemen. From his perspective, that was a crowd. At first the young man thought that the police were after him, but that would assume that the little man had squawked, and the young man could categorically discount that possibility. While waiting for the bus to come, the young man hadn't much to do other than keep an eye on the little man, smash his office phone to bits, and patch up the office door as best he could. When the bus eventually came, and the young man noted that it had no passengers, he immediately decided to kidnap both the driver and the bus. It took all of 20 seconds to persuade the bus driver to turn the bus around and drive northwards again. Close to a personal record, the young man reflected, as he sat down in the exact seat where the geriatric he had sat. He was now chasing and had been sitting earlier in the same day. The bus driver quivered with fear, but got through the worst of it with a calming cigarette. Smoking was of course forbidden on board the bus, but the only law the driver was subject to at the moment was sitting just diagonally behind him in the bus, and was slightly built and had long greasy blonde hair, a straggly beard, and a denim jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back. On the way, the young man asked where the elderly suitcase thief had gone. The driver said that the old man had got off at Byringe station, and that was probably entirely random, explaining the backward way the old man had gone about things, offering a 50-crown note and asking how far he could get with that. The driver didn't know much about Byringe station except that it was rare for anyone to get on or off there. Supposedly there was a closed down railway station some way in the forest, and Byringe village was somewhere in the vicinity. The geriatric couldn't have got much further than the driver guessed. The man was very old, and the suitcase was heavy, even though it had wheels. The young man immediately calmed down. He'd refrained from calling the boss in Stockholm because the boss was one of the few people who could scare people more effectively than the young man himself. The young man shivered at the thought of what the boss would say about the suitcase going astray. Better to solve the problem first and tell him later. And seeing as how the old man hadn't gone all the way to Strangnas or even beyond, the suitcase should be back in the hands of the young man quicker than he feared. "Here's the Byringe station bus stop," The driver slowly rolled to the side of the road and prepared to die. But it turned out that his time had not come. Although his mobile phone wasn't so lucky, it met with rapid death under one of the young man's boots, and a whole stream of death threats directed at the driver's relatives spewed out of the young man's mouth, designed to avert any possible thought of the driver contacting the police, instead of turning the bus around and continuing the journey to Flen. Then the young man got off and let the driver and bus escape. The poor driver was so terrified that he didn't dare turn the bus round, but he continued all the way to Strangnas, parked in the middle of Tradgard Street, walked in shock into the Delia Hotel, where he rapidly downed 4 glasses of whiskey. Then, to the bartender's horror, he started to cry. After a further 2 glasses of whiskey, the bartender offered him a telephone in case he wanted to phone somebody. The bus driver started to cry again and called his girlfriend. The young man thought he could make out tracks in the gravel on the road, tracks of a suitcase on wheels. This would be over in no time, which was a good thing, because it was getting dark. Off and on the young man wished that he had done a bit more planning. It struck him that he was standing in a rapidly darkening forest, and it soon would be pitch black. What would he do then? These troubled thoughts ended when he first caught sight of a shabby, partly boarded up yellow building near the bottom of the hill, and when somebody turned on a light on the upper floor, the young man mumbled, "Now I've got you, you old geezer!" Alan quickly stopped peeing. Then he carefully opened the toilet door and tried to hear what was happening in the kitchen. Soon enough, his worst fear was confirmed. Alan recognized the young man's voice bellowing at Julius Johnson to reveal where the other old bastard was. Alan sneaked over to the kitchen door silently because he was wearing bedroom slippers. The young man had grasped Julius by both ears, the same hold he'd had earlier practiced on the little man at the station in Malcoping. While he shook poor Julius, he continued his interrogation. Alan thought the young man should have been satisfied with finding the suitcase, which was standing right in the middle of the room. Julius grimaced and made no move to answer. Alan reflected that the old timber merchant was quite a tough guy and looked around for a suitable weapon. Amidst the junk he saw a small number of candidates: a crowbar, a plank, a container of insect spray, and a packet of rat poison. Alan first settled on the rat poison, but couldn't just then figure out a way to get a spoonful or 2 into the young man. The crowbar, on the other hand, was a bit too heavy for the centenarian to lift, and the insect spray, no, it would have to be a plank. So Alan took a firm hold of his weapon, and with 4 sensationally fast steps for his age, he was right behind his intended victim. The young man must have sensed that Alan was there, because just as the old man took aim, the youth loosened his hold on Julius Johnson and spun around. He received the plank slap bang in the middle of his forehead, stood still where he was and stared for a second before he fell backwards and hit his head on the edge of the kitchen table. No blood, no groaning, nothing. He just lay there with his eyes closed. "Good one," said Julius. "Thanks," said Alan. Now where's the dessert you promised? Alan and Julius sat down at the kitchen table with the long-haired youth, unconscious, at their feet. Julius poured the brandy, gave one glass to Alan, and raised his own to a toast. Alan raised his glass. "So," said Julius, when they'd emptied their glasses, "I'm betting that's the owner of the suitcase." Alan realised that it was time for him to explain a thing or two in more detail. Not that there was so much to explain. Most of what had happened during the day was hard for Alan himself to understand. But he described the events, his defection from the home, his spontaneous seizure of the suitcase at the station in Malcoping, and the fear at the back of his mind that the young man who now lay on the floor would probably quickly catch up with him. And he sincerely apologised for the fact that Julius now sat there with red and throbbing ears. But Julius said that Alan most certainly shouldn't be apologising for the fact that there was finally a bit of action in Julius Johnson's life. Julius was back in good form. He thought it was high time that they both had a look at what was in the suitcase. When Alan pointed out that it was locked, Julius told him not to be silly. "Since when has a lock stopped Julius Johnson?" asked Julius Johnson. "But there was a time for everything," he went on. "There was the matter of the problem on the floor. It wouldn't do if the young man were to wake up and then carry on from where he left off when he passed out. Alan suggested that they tie him to a tree outside the station building. But Julius objected that if the young man shouted loudly enough when he woke up, he would be heard down in the village. There were only a handful of families still living there, but all had, with more or less good reason, a bit of a grudge against Julius, and they would probably be on the young man's side if they got the chance. Julius had a better idea. Off the kitchen was an insulated freezer room where he stored his poached and butchered elks. For the time being, the room contained no elks and the fan was turned off. Julius didn't want to use the freezer unnecessarily because it used a hell of a lot of electricity. Julius had, of course, hot-wired it, and it was Goster at Forest Cottage Farm who unwittingly paid. But it was important to steal electricity in moderation if you wanted to keep taking advantage of the perk for a long time. Alan inspected the turned-off freezer and found it to be an excellent cell without any unnecessary amenities. The 6 by 9 feet was perhaps more space than the youth deserved, but there was no need to make conditions unnecessarily harsh. The old men dragged the young man into the freezer. He groaned when they put him on an upturned wooden chest in one corner and propped his body against the wall. He seemed about to wake up. Best hurry out and lock the door properly. No sooner said than done, upon which Julius lifted the suitcase onto the kitchen table, looked at the lock, licked clean the fork he'd just used for the evening's roast elk with potatoes, and picked the lock in a few seconds. Then he beckoned Alan over for the actual opening on the grounds that it was Alan's booty after all. "Everything of mine is yours too," said Alan. "We share and share alike. But if there's a pair of shoes in my size, then I bags them." Upon which Alan opened the lock. "What the hell?" said Alan. "What the hell?" said Julius. "Let me out!" could be heard from the freezer room. The end of chapter 3. You'll have to wait for the next one, chapter 4, which is very exciting, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening, but I will do the other one soon in case you're listening and want to know what happens next, because I know it is so funny. You might not have laughed at this bit, but the laughter's coming, so you just have to listen on to the next one, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that more than this part, the opening of the case and telling you what's in it. So next one is chapter 4, but it might not be the opening of the case, because what happens with this writer, it goes back to the last century, or it goes back to like 1905 to 1929, so you have to actually probably wait for chapter 5 to find out what is in the suitcase. So that means I have to record chapter 4 before you can hear the contents of the suitcase, so that'll make for some interesting waiting time. Alright, God bless, have a great day. I hope you like this so far. I did tell you the name of the book at the beginning. It is The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out of the Window and Disappeared. Alright, bye bye for now.